Hampstead, North London. The evening of Friday, the 24th of October, 1890. Gas lamps threw pale islands of light onto the damp cobbles, their glow swallowed quickly by the autumn fog. Along Crossfield Road, a passer-by stumbled upon what he first took to be a drunk collapsed in the chill. But when the constable's lantern cast its beam across the figure, the truth emerged. A woman, her throat cut so deeply the head seemed near severed, the body swaddled in a man's cardigan. A mile away, abandoned on a quiet suburban street, a perambulator stood in eerie silence. Its seat and hood were drenched in blood. Before the week was out, newspapers would call it the most appalling crime to trouble London since the horrors of Whitechapel. And the name, whispered in dread, was Mary Piercy. In the closing years of the 19th century, Hampstead was still a place of contrasts. Elegant villas with neat front gardens lined the broad avenues, while only streets away, modest terraces and narrow courts housed clerks, artisans and servants. The district prided itself on respectability, a retreat from the din and danger of the East End. Yet London's fears were not so easily held at bay. The terror of Whitechapel, only 2 years past, lingered in the city's imagination. The gas-lit streets could still swallow the unwary. Horse-drawn cabs rattled along the high road. Newsboys shouted the evening's headlines, and in parlours, behind lace-curtained windows, tea was being poured. It was, on the surface, an ordinary Friday in late October. But before the night was out, Hampstead's calm facade would be ripped away, and the suburb would awaken to a crime whose cruelty would chill the whole metropolis. The story that would end in blood on the cobblestones began, as such things often do, with lives that crossed in ways both ordinary and fateful. Phoebe Hogg, 31 years old, was a woman of steady habits, known in her Hampstead circle for her quiet composure and devotion to her infant daughter. Married to Frank Hogg, a furniture remover by trade, she kept a respectable home, and was described by neighbours as gentle in manner and of kindly disposition. Her daughter, 18-month-old Phoebe, affectionately called Tiggy, was a bright-eyed child with curling hair, often seen riding at the perambulator that would later become a grim exhibit. Mary Eleanor Piercy was 24, tall, dark-haired, and in public could seem almost vivacious. Born Mary Wheeler, she had been raised in less comfortable circumstances and had known periods of hardship before coming to London. She worked variously in domestic service and in light factory work, and was not without friends or admirers. Yet behind her easy conversation there was restlessness. Her neighbours recalled an air of guardedness, as if part of her life was kept under deliberate lock and key. Frank Hogg, in whose life these two women's worlds converged, was a man in his 30s, accustomed to charm and to movement between social spheres. In one company he was the devoted husband and tradesman. In another he was the intimate companion of Miss Piercy. It was a connection neither wholly concealed nor openly acknowledged, and one that carried with it the combustible potential of jealousy and resentment. Around them stood figures who would later enter the annals of the case. The landladies and neighbours who heard shouts and the crash of breaking glass, the police constables who walked their beats along the high street and quiet back lanes, and the detectives from Scotland Yard, some of them veterans of the Ripper inquiries, summoned to Hampstead when the scale of the crime became clear. Each would play a part in piecing together the chain of events, though not all would agree on where the truth lay. These were the dramatis personae of an autumn tragedy. A wife, a lover, a man between them, and a community about to find itself at the centre of a crime that would command London's attention from the first shock of discovery to the last echo of the gallows bell. On the afternoon of Friday, the 24th of October 1890, the quiet rhythm of Crossfield Road in Hampstead was disturbed. At about 3:30, neighbours observed Mrs. Phoebe Hogg walking with her perambulator, her daughter Tiggy nestled beneath a blanket. She was heading toward Priory Street, the home of Mary Piercy. What passed between the two women in the hours that followed would be known only to them. By 4 o'clock, sounds began to carry into the narrow passageways between the houses. A sudden crash of breaking glass, the muffled thump of something falling, and a woman's voice raised in alarm. Mrs. Charlotte Piddington, living in the adjoining house, would later recall under oath that she heard a loud, violent quarrel and a child crying in distress. Other residents reported an unfamiliar scraping sound, as though heavy furniture were being dragged across bare boards. When the autumn light began to fade and gas lamps flickered to life along the high street, Piercy was seen wheeling the black perambulator away from her home. Elizabeth Rogers, a neighbour, told police she thought it curious that Miss Piercy's head was bent low, and that she pushed with an unusual, effortful gait, as if the load were heavier than a child, and a few blankets. At approximately 7:30 that evening, a passer-by named Samuel MacDonald noticed a dark shape sprawled awkwardly on the cobblestones of Crossfield Road. The figure was still, the garments disordered. Thinking the person merely drunk, MacDonald passed on, but something in the position of the body drew him back. He returned with Constable William Robinson, whose bull's-eye lantern cut a sudden path through the mist. The light fell upon a woman's face, pale and still, the throat slashed so deeply that the head seemed nearly severed from the body. Only later would the constable and his superiors learn that at almost the same hour, a mile away in Kentish Town, another constable had discovered an abandoned perambulator standing in eerie stillness under the gaslight. The hood and seat were saturated with blood. No child lay within. By the time word reached the local police station, the connection between the two discoveries was not yet clear. But the crime, already monstrous in its particulars, would grow in horror as the missing infant's fate became known, and as suspicion turned toward a woman the public had not yet imagined capable of such acts. Within hours of the grisly discoveries, both sites were under guard. One in Crossfield Road, where the body of a woman lay until the coroner's arrival. The other in Kentish Town, where the blood-soaked perambulator stood abandoned in the dim light of a street lamp. Word travelled quickly through Hampstead's shop-fronts, parlours and taverns, each retelling, sharpening the horror. The St. Pancras Gazette would note that women drew their shawls tight and hurried from the street while men lingered in knots, speaking low of the miscreant abroad. By nightfall, the shock had reached Scotland Yard. Detective Inspector Donald Swanson, already known to the public for his role in the Whitechapel murders inquiry, was assigned to lead the case. His arrival in Priory Street, accompanied by uniformed constables, drew curious neighbours to their windows. Inside Mary Piercy's modest home, the officers found the first tangible connection to the night's events. A kitchen floor darkened with blood, splashes staining the wallpaper, even the ceiling marked with a spatter that bespoke violence of considerable force. A hearthrug had been hastily rolled aside. In a cupboard, wrapped in newsprint, lay a poker and a carving knife, both streaked with blood and hair. Piercy, when questioned about these, did not feign ignorance. She smiled faintly and said, according to one constable's statement, "I had a problem with mice, killing mice, killing mice." The phrase, repeated for the record, would later be quoted in every major London newspaper. Neighbours offered fragments that, pieced together, formed an unsettling picture. Mrs. Charlotte Piddington heard glass break and a child scream sometime after 4 o'clock. Elizabeth Rogers saw Piercy pushing the pram along a back lane, her head bowed, her gait slow as though burdened by an unnatural weight. A grocer's boy recalled seeing her pause beneath a lamp-post, adjusting a shawl that covered the pram's contents. By morning the London press had seized on the story. The Star described an outrage of singular atrocity committed in the very heart of respectable Hampstead, while Lloyd's Weekly grimly observed that such horrors are no longer confined to the shadowed courts of the East End. Rumour thrived. Some swore they had seen Piercy with the Hoggs earlier that day. Others whispered of a quarrel between wife and mistress over the child's future. Fear moved faster than fact. Parents kept children indoors, and solitary walkers avoided the lanes after dusk. For Hampstead, a district that prided itself on civility and safety, the knowledge that such violence had erupted within its borders was a wound to the very idea of order. And for the police, the pressing question was no longer whether they had a murder, but whether they already had the murderer under their very roof. By the second day, the threads began to draw together. Constables traced the perambulator to a local maker who confirmed its ownership. It had been seen in Piercy's possession for months. Bloodstains from its frame matched those found in her kitchen, while a scrap of fabric clinging to the wheel was consistent with the shawl worn by Mrs. Hogg that day. Frank Hogg was interviewed at length. He admitted to knowing Piercy for several years, describing her as a close friend who had, on occasion, looked after his wife and child, an admission that only sharpened the public's fascination. When pressed on the nature of his relationship with Piercy, his answers were careful, yet witnesses soon came forward to suggest it was an intimacy of long standing. Piercy herself, though under close scrutiny, maintained a calm and even manner. She did not deny that Phoebe Hogg had visited her on the afternoon in question, nor that the child had been present. Yet she insisted they had left her house alive and well. The blood in her kitchen, she repeated, was the result of killing mice, a statement that, reported in the press, became a morbid refrain across London. Detectives also secured statements from multiple neighbours who had seen Piercy manoeuvring the pram along back streets that evening, her head lowered, her pace slow and deliberate. One witness swore he saw her pause at a junction, glance about, and then turn down a less frequented lane toward the spot where the perambulator was later found. Inquests into the deaths of Phoebe and Tiggy Hogg began before a coroner at Hampstead, with medical testimony confirming that the mother had died from deep wounds to the throat, while the child had been smothered. The coroner's jury, visibly moved, returned a verdict of willful murder against Mary Piercy, and she was formally committed for trial at the Old Bailey. For the public, the transformation of suspicion into formal charge was both a relief and a source of fresh unease. To some, the idea that such acts could be committed by a woman, and against another woman and her child, was almost beyond belief. To others, it was precisely the betrayal of familiarity that made the crime so monstrous. In the press and the parlour alike, the name Mary Piercy had become synonymous with a new kind of danger. On the 1st of December 1890, the case of Regina versus Piercy was called before the Central Criminal Court at the Old Bailey. The galleries were packed. Journalists, society ladies, and curious onlookers jostled for a view of the woman accused of the Hampstead atrocity. In Lloyd's Weekly, a reporter described her as mild, harmless-looking, her dark hair neatly coiled, yet her eyes and mouth were never at rest. The Crown's case, led by Mr. Forrest Fulton and Mr. Charles Gill, unfolded with careful precision. They alleged that Piercy had invited Mrs. Hogg and her child to tea, that a quarrel had erupted over Frank Hogg, and that in a sudden burst of violence she struck Phoebe with a poker, then cut her throat with a carving knife. The child, they contended, had been smothered beneath the mother's body before both were carried away in the perambulator under cover of dusk. Witness after witness took the stand. Mrs. Charlotte Piddington recounted the sound of breaking glass and a child's cry. Elizabeth Rogers told of Piercy pushing the heavy pram, head bowed along the back streets. A grocer's boy described her stopping beneath a lamp to adjust a concealing shawl. Medical men testified to the nature of the wounds, to the presence of blood in Piercy's kitchen, and to the impossibility of the killing mice. Explanation. Piercy's defence was ably conducted by Mr. Arthur Newton, who sought to cast doubt on the chain of evidence and to suggest that others might have had cause to harm the Hoggs. Yet the weight of testimony was against her. When called upon for her own account, Piercy admitted the visit, admitted the pram journey, but denied the killings outright. She ended with the curious remark, "I would not do such a dreadful thing, and I have nothing to confess." The jury retired, and after a brief deliberation, returned with their verdict: guilty of willful murder. The judge, donning the black cap, pronounced the sentence of death. Through it all, Piercy remained composed, gazing steadily at the bench. In the press, the verdict was reported with a kind of grim satisfaction, yet there remained a lingering disquiet, for the full truth of what had passed in Priory Street that autumn afternoon rested with a woman who, if she knew it, would never say. In the weeks that followed her conviction, Mary Piercy remained in the condemned cell at Newgate Prison. Visitors remarked upon her composure. She received the prison chaplain daily and read from the scriptures, yet she spoke little of the crime. To the end, she denied making any confession. On the morning of the 23rd of December, 1890, she walked to the scaffold with an unhurried step. Moments before the hood was drawn, she is said to have told the chaplain, "My sentence is a just one, but a good deal of the evidence against me was false." The execution drew a crowd outside the prison gates, though public executions had been abolished decades before. Inside, the hangman James Billington carried out his office swiftly. Within minutes, Piercy's body was taken down and buried in the prison yard. In the months after, Madame Tussauds unveiled a waxwork likeness of Piercy, dressed as Chic had appeared in the dock. Alongside it were displayed the black perambulator, the poker, and the carving knife, the very objects that had featured so prominently in the trial. Thousands came to see them, queuing in the winter streets for a glimpse. In Hampstead, the case lingered in memory. The lane where the Pram was found became, for a time, a place avoided after dark. Parents recalled the headlines and kept their children close on evening errands. For criminologists and journalists alike, Piercy's case would remain notable not only for its brutality, but for the inversion of expectation, the killer as a woman, the victim as both wife and child, the instrument of crime, an object of domesticity. And so the name Mary Piercy passed into the darker annals of London's criminal history, not as a mystery unresolved, but as a reminder that the most terrible acts may come from those least suspected, and that beneath the calm facades of respectability, shadows may be waiting.